Imagine being born into a royal family and discovering that your marriage has already been decided before you are old enough to understand what marriage means. The man waiting for you may live hundreds of miles away. He may speak another language. Your kingdoms may have fought each other for generations. But now your wedding is not about love. It is a treaty. A border is being redrawn through your dowry. A rival army is being neutralized through your unborn children. A conquered dynasty is being absorbed through your bloodline. And sometimes, the bride herself becomes a guarantee. In the ancient world, kings understood something brutally simple: armies could seize land, but marriages could make that conquest permanent. A daughter could become the price of peace. A sister could become the bond between two rival rulers. A son-in-law could inherit territory. A child born from a politically valuable marriage could become the living proof that two competing dynasties now belonged to the same world. But there was an even darker side. When kings married for power, ordinary ideas of choice, romance, and personal freedom often mattered very little. Marriage could become diplomacy. Marriage could become surveillance. Marriage could become a method of controlling inheritance. And in the hands of ambitious rulers, it could become a weapon. But what really happened? Long before the great royal houses of medieval Europe, marriage was already deeply connected to property, inheritance, status, and political power. In ancient Mesopotamia, marriage could be formalized through a legal contract. The surviving laws associated with Hammurabi show that marriages involved bride price, dowry, property rights, divorce conditions, and penalties when agreements were broken. A marriage was not simply a private relationship. It could determine where wealth went, who inherited property, and which families became connected. That distinction matters. Because once rulers controlled enormous territories, the same logic could be applied on an international scale. Instead of connecting two households, a royal marriage could connect two kingdoms. One of the clearest examples comes from Assyria. The Assyrian Empire became famous for military conquest, but its foreign policy did not rely on armies alone. Assyrian rulers also used diplomatic marriages and the exchange of aristocratic hostages to secure treaties and control neighboring states. In one documented case, King Sargon II gave his daughter in marriage to Ambaris, the ruler of Bitpurutas in Anatolia. The arrangement was extraordinarily political. The princess's dowry included territory, and her marriage helped transform Ambaris into the ruler of an important buffer kingdom protecting Assyria from rival powers. The daughter was therefore not merely entering another royal household. Her marriage helped redraw the strategic map. And the Assyrians had another tool: hostages. Members of allied or subject ruling families could be sent to the Assyrian court, where their presence helped guarantee the loyalty of their relatives back home. Marriage and hostage-taking therefore existed within the same political world. One created a bond. The other made breaking that bond dangerous. But Egypt would demonstrate just how powerful a marriage could become when two empires were exhausted by war. In the 13th century BCE, Egypt and the Hittite Empire were two of the dominant powers of the ancient Near East. They had fought over strategic territory in the Levant, and the struggle eventually produced one of antiquity's most famous battles, Kadesh. The clash between Ramesses II of Egypt and the Hittite king Muwatalli II did not produce the decisive Egyptian victory later royal propaganda sometimes suggested. Instead, both powers remained capable of threatening the other. And eventually, something remarkable happened. They negotiated peace. The resulting Egyptian-Hittite treaty, traditionally dated to around 1259 BCE, is one of the oldest surviving international peace treaties. Versions of the agreement survive in both Egyptian and Hittite contexts. But diplomacy did not stop with words carved into stone. A royal marriage followed. Evidence indicates that in the later part of Ramesses II's reign, the Egyptian king married a Hittite princess, strengthening the relationship between the two royal courts. Think about what that meant. Yesterday, the two kingdoms had been military rivals. Now a Hittite princess entered the Egyptian royal household. Her marriage symbolized something an army could never communicate so elegantly. The enemy had become family. But that was exactly why royal women could become politically important. The marriage transformed a hostile relationship into a dynastic connection, while giving both sides additional reasons to preserve the peace. There is an important warning here, however. We should not imagine that the princess personally controlled the peace treaty, or that we know exactly what she thought about the marriage. The surviving evidence tells us far more about kings, treaties, and states than about the private emotions of the women sent into these arrangements. And that imbalance appears again and again in ancient history. The rulers who negotiated the marriages became famous. The women whose lives made those alliances possible were often reduced to names in a genealogy. But sometimes a marriage did something even more ambitious than ending a war. It attempted to merge cultures. In 327 BCE, Alexander the Great married Roxana, a Bactrian princess. The marriage connected the Macedonian conqueror with an influential local family at a time when Alexander was expanding deeper into Central Asia. Then, 3 years later, Alexander staged one of the most extraordinary royal marriage ceremonies of the ancient world. At Susa in 324 BCE, Alexander himself married women from the Achaemenid royal family, while many of his senior companions married Iranian noble women. Ancient sources describe a vast ceremony involving scores of couples. The symbolism was enormous. Alexander had conquered the Persian Empire. Now he was publicly connecting his Macedonian ruling elite with Persian aristocratic families. Marriage was being used to make conquest look like succession. Instead of saying, "The Persian Empire has been destroyed and replaced," Alexander could present something more complicated. The old ruling world and the new ruling world are being joined. But historians debate exactly what Alexander intended. For a long time, the Susa marriages were interpreted as part of a grand plan to fuse Greeks and Persians into a new mixed ruling class. Modern scholarship has urged caution. There was little evidence that Alexander created a truly equal fusion of the two aristocracies, and the extent of his long-term program remains debated. And then came the twist. Alexander died in 323 BCE. His vast empire fractured. The marriages he had staged as symbols of unity suddenly existed inside a political world that was falling apart. That is one of the great weaknesses of marriage diplomacy. A marriage can survive a king. But the political system supporting it may not. And nowhere was that problem more dramatic than Rome. To understand Roman power, you have to look beyond the Senate and the legions. Look at the family tree. During the final years of the Roman Republic, political alliances were frequently reinforced by marriage. And one of the most famous examples involved Julius Caesar, Pompey, and Caesar's daughter Julia. Julia was married to Pompey, creating a family connection between two of the most powerful men in Rome. For a time, this relationship helped strengthen their political partnership. But marriages could not permanently solve political rivalry. Eventually, Caesar and Pompey became enemies. The family bond disappeared beneath the machinery of civil war. Then came Augustus. He understood something even deeper. If Rome was going to accept one man's family as the center of imperial power, then the family itself had to be managed with almost military precision. Augustus arranged marriages among members of the ruling family and used relationships to shape succession, alliances, and status. His daughter Julia was successively married to Marcellus, Agrippa, and Tiberius. Recent scholarship emphasizes how unusually concentrated these marriage arrangements were within Augustus's dynasty. A wedding could therefore determine who stood closest to the emperor. Who might inherit? Who might produce the next generation? And who would remain outside the inner circle? The Roman royal family was not simply a family. It was becoming a political institution. But perhaps the most famous Roman example of marriage as a political weapon came from an even more dangerous triangle. Mark Antony, Octavian, and Cleopatra. After the assassination of Caesar, Rome was sliding toward another civil war. Antony and Octavian needed a political settlement. So Antony married Octavian's sister, Octavia. According to Plutarch, the marriage was deliberately presented as a means of restoring harmony between the two powerful men. Octavia herself later became trapped between them as their rivalry deepened. For a moment, marriage appeared to work. The two men cooperated. Military resources were exchanged. Political tensions temporarily eased. But then Antony's relationship with Cleopatra became central to the conflict. Octavia had become something close to a living peace treaty. And when the treaty failed, she could not stop the war. The result was catastrophic. The struggle between Antony and Octavian ended with Antony and Cleopatra defeated. The political message was unmistakable. A marriage could postpone a war. It could not necessarily prevent one. But in medieval Europe, dynastic marriage would become even more sophisticated. Because now kingdoms could be acquired not only through conquest. They could sometimes be inherited. In medieval Europe, land was power. An inheritance was political ammunition. Few marriages illustrate this better than that of Eleanor of Aquitaine and Henry of Anjou in 1152. Eleanor had enormous territories in southwestern France. Her marriage to Louis VII of France had been annulled, and she regained control of her lands. Only weeks later, she married Henry, Count of Anjou and Duke of Normandy. Suddenly, Henry was linked by marriage to one of the most powerful territorial inheritances in Western Europe. The marriage shocked political observers because its consequences were enormous. Eleanor was not a princess waiting passively to be exchanged between kingdoms. She was an heiress with territory. Her marriage changed the balance of power. Henry would eventually become King of England, and the territories associated with the Angevin realm stretched across enormous portions of France and England. Yet this story also reveals an important truth. Marriage could be a weapon against men too. The man might gain land through the marriage. But the woman might bring the land into the marriage. And that created conflicts over who actually controlled the inheritance. Eleanor herself remained a major political actor, and later rebelled against Henry. The marriage that helped create a powerful dynasty eventually became part of the story of rebellion within that dynasty. So marriage could unite power. But it could also concentrate so much power inside one family that the family itself became the battlefield. But that wasn't the whole story. For many royal women, political marriage meant leaving behind everything familiar. A princess could be sent across mountains, deserts, or seas to a court where she did not speak the dominant language. She could be expected to produce heirs. Her children could become bargaining chips in future conflicts. Her dowry could determine territorial claims. And her position could depend entirely on the survival of the dynasty she married into. The surviving legal and diplomatic records reveal a world in which marriage contracts could regulate property, divorce, inheritance, and obligations. In Mesopotamia, for example, the legal framework surrounding marriage was detailed enough that specific consequences could be attached to the dissolution of the relationship. But there is another danger when studying these societies. We often see only the perspective of rulers. Kings left inscriptions celebrating treaties. Officials recorded dowries. Chroniclers recorded marriages. Priests documented royal ceremonies. But the private experiences of brides are much harder to recover. That means some of the most dramatic stories repeated online about ancient royal women are impossible to prove. A historian has to resist the temptation to turn a missing record into a sensational story. Sometimes we simply do not know. And that uncertainty is historically important. Because the people being used as political instruments were real human beings, even when the surviving sources reduced them to one line in a royal genealogy. Then something unexpected happened. In some cases, women who entered political marriages were not powerless figures at all. They became rulers. Queens. Regents. Diplomats. Landowners. And occasionally, political operators in their own right. The weapon could turn around and be used by the person holding it. Dynastic marriage could stop wars. It could secure borders. It could bring territories into a new dynasty. It could create heirs whose ancestry legitimized competing claims. And it could turn enemies into relatives. But every advantage carried a danger. A marriage could create too much concentrated power. A disputed inheritance could become the justification for war. A child could become the center of a succession crisis. A widow could control property that powerful men wanted. A royal family could become so interconnected that a conflict inside one household spread across entire kingdoms. That is why the family trees of ancient and medieval rulers can look almost impossible to follow. They were not merely records of who loved whom. They were maps of power. When two rulers married their children, they were potentially negotiating borders. When a king married an heiress, he could acquire claims to land. When an emperor married a foreign princess, he could attempt to legitimize conquest. When a royal daughter was sent abroad, she could become a living guarantee that a treaty would survive. And when the marriage failed, the consequences could reach far beyond the palace. Armies could move. Treaties could collapse. Kingdoms could change hands. Entire dynasties could disappear. For thousands of years, powerful rulers understood that war was expensive. Soldiers had to be paid. Cities had to be supplied. Fortresses had to be built. People had to die. Marriage offered another possibility. No battlefield. No siege. No burning city. Just a ceremony. A crown placed beside another crown. Two families joined. A contract sealed. And perhaps a child born years later who could suddenly possess a stronger claim to a kingdom than either army could create. That is what makes dynastic marriage so fascinating and so disturbing. Because behind the golden crowns, magnificent ceremonies, and royal celebrations was a much colder calculation. Who gets the land? Who produces the heir? Who controls the dynasty? Who benefits when two bloodlines become one? And who pays the price when the marriage is no longer useful? From Mesopotamia to Assyria, from Egypt to Persia, from Rome to medieval Europe, marriage repeatedly became more than a personal relationship. It became diplomacy. It became inheritance. It became legitimacy. And sometimes, it became a weapon. The question is not simply whether these rulers used marriage to control history. They clearly did. The deeper question is this. When history remembers the kings who arranged these marriages, has it remembered fairly the people whose lives were sacrificed to make those political alliances possible? Because behind every dynastic alliance was a human being. And sometimes, the quietest marriage ceremony was the opening move of the next great war.